I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. Something that a woman named Margaret Thorne experienced and documented over the course of 4 years. Something that cost her career. Something that the organization responsible for managing the land where it happened decided never happened at all. The reason I'm telling you this story is because Margaret finally agreed to talk to me after 3 years of refusing to. If you find this story raises questions about what we're not being told, hit subscribe, like this episode, tell someone, because the only way these stories survive is if we share them. Now, let's continue with Margaret's story. She was the director of the Ouachita Land Trust from 2013 to 2021. The Land Trust manages approximately 12,000 acres of forest in the southern reaches of the Ouachita National Forest. It's good land, old growth forest mixed with secondary growth that's reclaiming space. Creeks that run year-round, cold and clear, and deep enough to get lost in if you're not paying attention. Ridgelines that you can see from 80 miles away on a clear day, purple-blue silhouettes against the sunset. Margaret held the director position for 8 years. She left it in 2021 under circumstances that she says were forced upon her. The official story that went public was that she retired due to personal reasons and wanted to step back from the intensive demands of land management. That's what the press release said. That's what the board of directors told people who asked. Margaret says that's not the whole truth, not even close. What she told me is that they pushed her out because she knew something about their property that they couldn't acknowledge, something that didn't fit into any official framework, something that threatened the funding structure and the public image that the organization had spent years building. What she knew was that something was living in those 12,000 acres, something that shouldn't exist by any conventional understanding of wildlife biology, something that had been living there long enough that trying to remove it was impossible, and trying to ignore it was becoming increasingly difficult. She's been living quietly in Hot Springs for the past 3 years now. She works as a conservation consultant. She does work that pays the bills and doesn't demand much emotional investment from her. She does her best to not think about the Ouachita Mountains at all. She said she had made a kind of peace with keeping quiet until she saw a video on the internet. Someone posted a blurry thermal image clip online about 6 months ago. It was shot on property adjacent to the Land Trust's holdings. The footage showed a large bipedal figure moving through thick brush at dusk. The figure was tall, maybe 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur or hair. The proportions were completely wrong for any documented animal. The comments filled up immediately. The usual mix of crypto enthusiasts and skeptics and people who just like to argue online about things they know nothing about. Bigfoot, DOGMAN, CGI, hoax, person in a suit. Margaret watched that 30-second clip and felt something shift inside her. She said she'd spent 3 years trying to convince herself that what happened up there could be rationalized, could be misidentified, could be something else entirely, some kind of bear standing weird, a tall person, a hallucination. The video broke that spell. She called me. She said she wanted to go on record finally. She wanted someone to know the actual story before it turned into folklore and half-truths and internet theories. She wanted the real version documented. She wanted people to understand what happened. So, I flew to Hot Springs and I sat with her in her living room. I listened while she laid out what happened. This is what she told me. Margaret grew up in the Ouachita region. Her family had property there. Nothing enormous, just about 180 acres of mixed hardwood forest up near the town of Mountain Home, Arkansas. It was the kind of land that people had because their grandfather bought it 40 years ago for nothing. And now it was worth something, but not enough to make you rich. Her father was a timber surveyor. His job was to walk through forests and assess the standing timber and calculate board feet and make recommendations about harvesting. He was good at it. Margaret said his eye could assess a stand of timber the way an art dealer can assess a painting. He could see the value and the composition and the future all at once. Her mother was a school teacher. She taught high school English. She had strong opinions about books and grammar and the importance of reading things carefully. They lived on the edge of the national forest, and they lived quietly. They didn't advertise their presence. They didn't need anything from anybody. Margaret spent her childhood in those woods. She knew every creek bed, every ridgeline, every seasonal clearing where the sun broke through the canopy. She knew them the way some kids know the layout of a house. She could navigate them in the dark. She could walk to specific places without thinking about it. She said the forest was her first language. She understood it the way most kids understand a city, the shapes and the sounds and the rhythms, where the water moved, where the animals traveled, what the different silences meant. Each silence was different. The silence of nothing happening was different from the silence of something listening. The silence of a place where animals had been was different from the silence of a place where they never came. By the time she was 9 years old, she could navigate by sound alone. She could close her eyes and walk through the forest, knowing exactly where she was, based on the calls of specific birds, the pitch of the wind through different tree species, the sound of water at different distances. The forest had a syntax. It had a grammar, and she had become fluent in it long before she learned the syntax of English sentences. Margaret's father taught her something that transcended typical wilderness education. He taught her to read the forest the way ancient peoples must have read it, not as a collection of disconnected facts or isolated data points, but as a living text where every mark, every sign, every subtle shift in pattern told a story. She would spend hours watching a single stretch of forest, not moving, barely breathing, just observing. She learned that patient observation revealed layers of meaning invisible to casual observers. She learned that animals left messages in their movements. The panicked flight of a deer told a different story than the cautious approach of a cautious predator. The depth of a track in soft earth revealed not just what had passed, but how fast it had been moving, whether it was carrying something, whether it was afraid or confident. By 15 years old, she could spend an hour in the forest and tell you the story of the past 3 days like reading a newspaper. She could tell you which animals had passed through, in what order, at what time of day. She could tell you which ones were predators and which were prey by the pattern of their movement. She could tell you where the elk had bedded down by the arrangement of compressed grass and the scattered dirt where they had pawed at the ground. Her father stopped taking her on expeditions and started asking her to lead the way whenever they went into the forest together. By 18, she was better at reading the land than experienced hunters with decades of experience. She had developed an almost preternatural sense of place and presence. When something was wrong in the forest, she could feel it, not through any mystical sense, but through the absence of things that should have been there, the lack of bird calls, the stillness of prey animals, the subtle shift in the wind that suggested something large moving through the trees. This ability to read silence became crucial to her later work. It was this skill that first alerted her to the presence of something wrong in the Ouachita forest. Her father would take her out for days at a time. She would lead. She would tell him what was coming. She would know where the elk had passed based on the arrangement of grass stems, based on the way the ferns were bent. She would know whether a fox or a coyote had crossed their path based on the shape of the print and the depth of the claw marks. The distance between prints told her whether the animal was walking or running. The depth of the hind print relative to the front print told her whether it was carrying something or just moving. She would know by the condition of the ground, the arrangement of pine needles, the broken twigs, which animals had passed and when. This was before anyone called it tracking. It was just paying attention. It was just listening. Her mother would ask her how she knew these things. Margaret said it was like reading. You just looked at what was in front of you, and the story told itself. The landscape was a text. You just had to learn to read it. She went away to college at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. She got a degree in environmental science. She spent 10 years working for the National Forest Service in various capacities. Started as a field technician, doing wildlife surveys. Worked her way up to a regional manager position, overseeing multiple forest sites across Arkansas and Oklahoma. But she never stopped thinking about the Ouachita region. She never stopped feeling that pull. She said that being away from those mountains felt like being away from part of herself. It wasn't romantic, it was physical. It was like missing a limb. She could feel the absence of it even when she wasn't thinking about it consciously. When the Ouachita Land Trust was looking for a director in 2013, she applied immediately. She was chosen. She moved back to Arkansas. She was given management authority over 12,000 acres of prime conservation land. It was her dream job. The kind of job that you fantasize about having when you're younger and then assume you'll never actually get. But she got it. She spent her first few months just walking the property, just reacquainting herself with every specific part of it. She took notes, she made maps, She understood the hydrology by tracing every creek and tributary. She understood the soil conditions by digging test pits and examining the layering. She understood the current forest composition and which way it was trending, whether the forest was aging, whether new growth was establishing, whether fire had come through. She could read the land the way she'd learned to read it as a child. For the first 4 years, everything went the way she expected. The land trust existed to protect old-growth forests and manage sustainable harvesting agreements that followed environmentally sound principles. Margaret worked with local communities, state agencies, and conservation groups. She did environmental education programs for school children from surrounding counties. She monitored trail conditions and erosion patterns. She published research on forest ecology in regional journals. The work was meaningful, and it was never boring. She said she was happy, genuinely happy, living in a small cottage on the property, managing the forest, doing work that she believed mattered. And then in 2017, she started noticing things. Small things at first, not the kind of obvious signs that would register immediately, but the kind of thing that accumulates over time. A gate that had been knocked off its hinges. This was the access gate to the back property. A steel gate on a frame of angle iron. The damage wasn't bent or degraded the way wind or animals normally damage things. It wasn't rust developing over time. The metalwork was warped, as if someone had grasped it and twisted with tremendous force. As if someone had taken hold of the gate and simply twisted it until the metal gave up. It was knocked completely off. The gate itself, which was steel and weighed probably 400 pounds, was lying 30 yards into the forest, as if it had been picked up and thrown like a person might throw a stick. Like it weighed nothing. That was October of 2017. Margaret reported it to the board. She said the gate needed to be replaced. There's a lot of equipment cost, but the gate is the barrier. It's our first line of control for access. They had a volunteer day and installed a new gate, bolted it on heavily, made it as secure as possible. 3 weeks later, in November, the new gate was destroyed the exact same way. The hingework twisted into an impossible configuration. The gate in the forest again. 30 yards in. This time, Margaret investigated more carefully. She found tracks in the soft ground near the hinge post. Very large tracks. Bipedal. 5-toed. It wasn't a bear. She'd seen bear tracks many times and knew what black bear prints look like. The 5 toes arranged in a particular way. The claw marks at specific distances from the toe pads. The characteristic shape of the hind paw, almost human-like. She'd studied black bear sign for a decade during her work with the Forest Service. She knew the 5 prints they left. She knew the claw marks. She knew the size range. This was something else entirely. These tracks were much larger. The stride was longer. The proportion of the toes was different. She took photographs with her field camera. She showed them to a wildlife biologist she knew, someone she trusted, someone who was careful about evidence, someone who would not immediately start talking about cryptids and not immediately dismiss her as crazy. The biologist was named Tom Graves. He taught at the University of Arkansas, where he had built a reputation for being meticulous about evidence and skeptical of extraordinary claims. He had published numerous papers on regional wildlife populations, on predator behavior patterns, on the documented fauna of the Ozark and Ouachita mountain ranges. He was precisely the kind of scientist who would demand absolute proof before acknowledging anything unusual. That made his reaction to the tracks even more significant. When Margaret brought him to the property that November afternoon, the sky was gray and threatening. The forest seemed to press in around them, and Tom fell into a contemplative silence as soon as they reached the gate. He examined the twisted hinges without comment, turning them over in his hands, understanding the mechanics of what would be required to do this damage. He looked at the gate lying in the forest, and something in his expression shifted. They walked to the site where the tracks had been found, and Tom knelt in the soft earth like an archaeologist approaching a significant artifact. He had brought professional measuring tools. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles, different lighting conditions, with scale markers for reference. He took rubbings of the clearest prints. He examined the soil composition and the depth of the impressions, which told him about the weight and gait of the creature that made them. Margaret watched his face as he worked. She had known Tom long enough to read his subtle reactions. When she saw him look at a particular track and actually step back, actually take a moment to collect himself, she knew he had encountered something that challenged his framework. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing. The tracks suggested something impossible. But Tom Graves was a scientist, and a good scientist follows evidence even when it contradicts prior assumptions. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The clinical confidence was gone. He taught at the University of Arkansas. Margaret had known him for years. They'd collaborated on some research projects involving forest ecology. He was the kind of scientist who took evidence seriously regardless of where it led. She brought him to the property. She showed him the hinge post. She showed him the track photographs. She showed him the gate lying in the forest. Tom Graves spent an hour examining the site. He measured the tracks carefully. He photographed them from multiple angles. He looked at the hinge work. He bent down and ran his hands over the twisted metal. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know what made those." And the look on his face told her that he understood it was something real, something that had left physical evidence, something that he also didn't know how to categorize. He said, "Margaret, these tracks are consistent with a large primate, but no primate that large exists in North America. Not documented, not officially, but the size, the configuration, this is bipedal, this is heavy." His voice trailed off. He didn't finish the sentence. She said, "What are you saying?" Tom said, "I'm saying that if I saw this in my official capacity, in my role as a biologist affiliated with the university, I would have to deny it. I would have to say it's a misidentification or a hoax, but I believe what you're showing me. I believe you found something real." She started keeping a log, a personal log, not official, something she could show people if they asked. She documented the gate destructions. They happened periodically. Every 6 to 8 weeks, the gate would be destroyed. She'd replace it. It would be destroyed again. She started leaving the gate alone for a few weeks between destructions to see if there was any kind of pattern. There wasn't. It seemed like whatever was doing this was on no schedule except its own. Like it came back to the gate on its own internal timetable. In between gate destructions, she started staying at the property overnight. The land trust had a small office building on the property, a converted barn with a bunk room for staff who needed to stay over during projects or emergencies. Margaret began spending nights there watching. She didn't know what she was waiting for, wasn't sure she wanted to see it, but found herself watching anyway. She set up lights around the building, nothing too bright, just enough to see if anything approached. Amber work lights on the corners. She sat at the window with her field notebook. She tried to establish a pattern, tried to track when things happened. On the third night of watching, in early March of 2018, she heard it. A vocalization, a sound that came from somewhere in the dark forest beyond the office building. It was low and resonant, more felt than heard, almost below the threshold of normal human hearing. She felt it in her chest cavity. She felt it resonate in her teeth, like standing too close to a subwoofer in a car. But it carried a quality that was unmistakably intentional. An animal vocalizing randomly doesn't create that quality. Language doesn't require words. It just requires the intention to communicate something, the intention to reach across the dark and be heard. Margaret described that sound to me in precise detail, and when she did, I could hear the weight it still carried for her. She said it was like nothing she had ever heard in her childhood forest education. It wasn't a howl or a roar or any of the vocalizations she could classify. It was somewhere between a whale's song, something she'd heard on a documentary once, and something entirely organic but utterly foreign. She said the frequency of it changed halfway through, as if the creature had deliberately shifted the pitch. She said the sound didn't fade naturally, but seemed to stop abruptly, like someone cutting off a recording. That deliberate quality was what unsettled her most. An animal doesn't stop vocalizing mid-breath. An animal doesn't consciously modulate its voice, unless it's communicating something intentional, unless it's sending a message with intention and structure. She said she spent that night absolutely still, barely breathing, listening to the darkness. Every sound became significant. The wind through the trees sounded like breathing, distant water sounded like movement, the settling of the building itself, the ancient groans of wood expanding and contracting, all of it suddenly seemed alive with possibility. She said she felt watched, not in the paranoid way, but in the way you feel watched when someone is genuinely looking at you, a conscious observation. She understood in that moment that something intelligent was aware of her presence in the forest, something that could think, something that could choose to communicate, and something that was waiting to see what she would do with that knowledge. Margaret described that sound to me. She said it was the most unsettling thing she'd ever heard. It wasn't aggressive and didn't sound immediately dangerous, but it sounded lonely instead. She said it was the sound of something that had learned language from humans, either by living near them over many years or by some other mechanism, but had never successfully spoken to them. An attempt at communication that would never succeed because no human would understand what it was trying to say. The sound lasted maybe 8 seconds. Then it stopped. Just silence again. Margaret sat in that office building and waited for morning. Nothing else happened that night. She didn't sleep. She just sat at the window and watched the forest and listened. Every sound made her jump. The wind, a branch falling, an animal moving through the brush. When the sun came up, she looked for tracks. She found them near the building, fresh, large. The ground was soft from recent rain. The prints were clear, bipedal. The stride was 7 to 8 feet long. The tracks led away from the building toward the deeper forest. She followed them for about a mile. Then the ground got harder and rockier, and she lost the trail. She turned back and walked to the building and sat down and tried to figure out what to do. She went back and called a meeting with the board of directors. She told them that there was a large animal on the property, something that was destroying their infrastructure. She said it needed to be documented and managed. She didn't mention the gate being picked up and thrown. She didn't mention the impossible strength. She said it was an unknown primate, possibly an undocumented species, and it needed professional attention. The board seemed uncomfortable with the idea of documenting anything, and Margaret realized it wasn't because they were skeptical. It was because they understood the implications. Thomas Brennan, the lawyer, was the one who articulated what the others were thinking. He said, "Margaret, we appreciate your diligence. We appreciate that you take your position seriously. But you have to understand that our mission is conservation, not cryptozoology. Our donors support us because they believe in protecting known species and habitats. If we start making claims about unknown creatures, we become a laughingstock. We lose credibility with the scientific community. We lose funding, and frankly, we expose ourselves to legal liability. What if someone gets hurt because they come to the property trying to find this creature? What if we make a claim about an unknown animal and we're wrong? We're setting ourselves up for disaster." Margaret argued that the evidence was worth investigating. She said, "Tom, this could be the most significant biological discovery in decades. The creature is clearly intelligent. It's clearly on our property. We have a responsibility to document it properly." Brennan said, "Our responsibility is to our stakeholders, not to every strange phenomenon that appears on our land. There are always unexplained events in the forest. That's the nature of wilderness. It doesn't mean we're obligated to investigate every one. We need to focus on what we can manage, what we can understand, what we can protect." Margaret understood in that moment that Brennan was right about one thing. The board was never going to support this. They had already made their decision. They had already decided that the evidence didn't matter if it threatened their institutional stability. And Margaret realized that she had a choice. She could accept that and move on. Or she could pursue this on her own and accept the consequences. The board seemed uncomfortable with the idea of documenting anything. They had a lawyer on the board. His name was Thomas Brennan. He represented land trust interests and handled legal documents. He asked Margaret directly whether she thought what was on the property was the sort of thing that could be proven, could be identified scientifically, in court, with evidence. She said she wasn't sure, not yet. Brennan said, "If it can't be proven, we have no obligation to acknowledge it. We have funding obligations to our donors. We have research commitments to state agencies. An unidentifiable animal doesn't fit into any of those frameworks. It creates liability. It creates uncertainty." Margaret said, "So what are we supposed to do? Just ignore it?" Brennan said, "We're supposed to manage our property and not make claims based on assumptions we can't substantiate." Margaret asked about the gate. Brennan said the gate could have been damaged by weather, or poachers, or kids from town causing trouble. There were always explanations. Margaret realized in that moment that the board wasn't going to help. They were going to pretend this wasn't happening until it went away, or until they could blame someone else for it, until it became someone else's problem. She decided to investigate on her own. She started doing more night watches. She set up a camera trap, the kind that uses motion detection and thermal imaging. She positioned it near the damaged gate. with the idea of capturing whatever was destroying it. She wanted evidence, real evidence. Within a week, the camera captured footage. It was only a few seconds, a large dark shape moving fast through the brush. The image was too obscured to be useful as evidence, but it was something. Margaret kept doing this. She would position cameras, collect footage, try to understand what was happening. She bought more cameras, expensive ones. She set them up at different locations. She spent her own money on this. Over the course of 6 months, she accumulated maybe 100 clips. Most were low quality, too far away, too much vegetation, too dark. But some were clearer. One clip showed the creature standing upright, looking directly at the camera, looking right at the lens. Margaret said that when she saw that clip, she understood that the thing knew it was being watched. It understood that she had placed the camera there, and it was acknowledging that fact. It wasn't curious the way an animal is curious. It wasn't testing the equipment. It was communicating. It was saying, "I see you watching." Margaret said that what made it worse was knowing that the creature understood. When she watched the footage, she could see the moment recognition happened. The way the creature's head tilted, the way its eyes tracked the camera, even though there was no visible iris, no pupil, just the thermal signature of deep intelligence looking back at the machine that was looking at it. She spent hours watching that footage, hours rewinding and replaying the moment the creature made eye contact with the lens. She said it was like looking at herself in a mirror and seeing someone else looking back. Someone who understood what a mirror was, someone who understood what a camera was, someone who understood the concept of being observed and chose to acknowledge it. That understanding was the most important part, not the strength, not the size, not the impossible physiology. The fact that it understood, that it grasped the concept of surveillance and responded with apparent willingness. Margaret said that moment changed everything for her. Before, she could pretend this was biology. Unknown biology, but biology. A large animal, undocumented, but still operating under normal animal rules. Instinct, appetite, territory. After seeing that footage, she couldn't maintain that pretense. This was something with cognition, something with intention, something that could choose to appear in front of cameras or choose not to. And it chose to appear. It chose to be seen. Chosen action implied agency. Agency implied consciousness. And consciousness at that level meant something entirely different than what most scientists were willing to acknowledge. Tom Graves, the biologist she'd shown the first tracks to, had called her after she sent him the footage. He said, "Margaret, I can't see this. I can't even know this exists, but I believe you." He said it was the most important discovery he'd ever seen, and also the most dangerous. Dangerous because it couldn't be published. Dangerous because no peer-reviewed journal would accept it. Dangerous because once you understood that something intelligent lived in the margins of human civilization, you had to ask where else they might be living. What other places might have been written off as hauntings or disappearances or animal attacks that were actually something else entirely. She started researching everything she could find. She read accounts of DOGMAN sightings from across North America, encounters in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. Arkansas itself had multiple reports. People describing bipedal creatures covered in dark hair, 7 to 9 feet tall, intelligence in the eyes. She read the Book of Enoch. She said that reading the Enoch passages was the first time anything she was researching felt like it might be describing what she was dealing with. The Book of Enoch describes hybrid beings, creatures with human intelligence and animal form. It describes watchers, entities that existed in the ancient past and allegedly procreated with human women and created offspring, Nephilim. Creatures that shouldn't exist in the modern world, but might be relics from a much earlier time. She said she doesn't actually believe in the Bible as literal truth, but the descriptions were specific enough that it felt like they were describing something real, something that had been documented, even if that documentation was thousands of years old. The passage she kept returning to was about how the Watchers taught mankind things that should have remained secret. They taught the secrets of metals, the secrets of weapons, the secrets of creation. They crossed a boundary that should have remained uncrossed, and they became trapped in the mortal world, unable to return, waiting, always waiting. She wondered if what was living in the Ouachita Mountains might be a remnant, an off-branch of human genetic history, something that had evolved or been created in the deep past and had somehow survived into the 21st century, something that had been left behind and was now living in the margins of the modern world, in the places that humans hadn't completely claimed. She also wondered, and this was the thought that kept her up at night, whether it had intentionally positioned itself on the land trust property, whether it had chosen to be there, or whether it was trapped, whether the property boundary meant nothing to it. But humans on the property meant something. She did more research. She looked at the history of the Ouachita region. She found records of missing persons going back decades, people who had disappeared in the national forest, young men mostly, a few women, construction workers, hunters, hikers, teenagers. The cases had official explanations: lost hikers, fugitives, suicides in remote places, accidental drowning in mountain streams. But the pattern, when you assembled it, was eerie. On average, one person every 2 years had gone missing in the Ouachita National Forest since the 1950s. Most were never found, some were discovered, but usually in a state that made identification difficult. Margaret said she started to wonder whether the creature she was documenting was responsible, or whether multiple creatures were responsible. She didn't know. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a large, dark gap in human knowledge. A gap where things that shouldn't exist were quietly existing, while the official story moved ahead without acknowledging any of it. She spent months researching now, not just cryptid sightings, but everything she could find about missing persons, about unexplained animal attacks, about territorial disputes in forests that had no clear animal cause. She found newspaper clippings going back decades, articles about hikers disappearing in remote areas, about hunters not coming home, about search parties finding no bodies, no signs of struggle, no explanations. The official conclusions were always that people got lost, that they fell into water, that they died of exposure. But the pattern Margaret saw was different. The missing persons were always young and healthy. They were usually experienced outdoorsmen. They didn't just get lost, they vanished. Their trucks or cars found parked, their tents found empty. No trails, no distress calls, no bodies recovered. Case after case after case, going back to the 1950s when records became consistent. One person, maybe two, every single year, vanishing in the Ouachita National Forest. Some in summer, some in fall, some in winter. No seasonal pattern, but a consistent presence. Something always taking someone. She started keeping maps. She marked the locations where people had disappeared. She overlaid them with the sighting reports of strange animals, large creatures, bipedal shapes. The overlay was almost perfect. The disappearances clustered in the exact areas where sightings were reported. She showed these maps to Tom Graves. He looked at them for a very long time without saying anything. Finally, he said, "Margaret, if this pattern is real, if this is actually happening, then we're looking at an active predation situation. A population of unknown animals actively hunting humans. That's not just a cryptid. That's a crisis that no one knows how to handle." He told her to be careful. He told her to consider very seriously whether she wanted to keep pursuing this. He said that once certain knowledge was known, it couldn't be unknown. And living with that knowledge, carrying it alone, was a different kind of burden than just suspecting something. But Margaret continued. She couldn't stop. She was committed now. She had seen too much. She knew too much. And she believed that truth mattered, that reality mattered, that whatever was happening in those mountains deserved documentation and acknowledgement. It was in this state of mind that she reached out to someone, a researcher who worked on cryptid documentation, a man named Robert Cross. He ran an organization that focused on anecdotal evidence of unknown animals. He was careful, methodical, and he didn't make claims he couldn't support. Margaret sent him some of her video footage. He watched it and called her within 2 days. He asked her directly whether she believed what she was documenting was real. She said she did. He said, "Then I need to come there." Robert Cross arrived in Arkansas in late September of 2018. Margaret picked him up in Hot Springs. She said he was not at all what she expected. He was younger than she thought he would be, maybe early 40s. He was quiet. He asked a lot of questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, not in proving a point, not in advancing some theory he'd already committed to. She took him to the property on a day when the forest was particularly quiet. They spent the first day just walking the perimeter, and Margaret noticed that Robert was observant in a different way than she was. She read the forest as a holistic system. He read it as a forensics investigator reads a crime scene. Every detail was potential evidence. He stopped frequently to examine things Margaret might have walked past. A place where bark had been stripped from a tree, not by normal animal action, but methodically, deliberately. A clearing that seemed deliberately maintained. An area where the undergrowth had been cleared in a pattern too geometric to be natural. A place where multiple trails converged, showing heavy use, suggesting regular passage. By the end of the first day, Robert was convinced that whatever Margaret had documented was real. He said, "Margaret, the evidence pattern here suggests habitation, intelligent modification of the environment, not just presence, but presence with purpose. That means we're not looking at a transient animal. We're looking at something that's established a territory and actively manages it. The implications of that are substantial." When they set up the equipment that night, Robert was meticulous about placement. He understood that what they were attempting was delicate. They needed evidence that was undeniable, but they also needed to remain unobtrusive. If they telegraphed their intentions too obviously, if the creature felt trapped or threatened, it might retreat deeper into the wilderness where documentation would be impossible. Robert explained to Margaret something she hadn't fully considered. He said, "If this creature is intelligent, and everything suggests it is, then it's probably been aware of human presence in this forest for a long time. It's learned our patterns. It knows when we're here and when we're not. It knows the difference between a person passing through and a person watching. By setting up these cameras, we're essentially asking it a question. We're saying, 'We see you. Will you acknowledge us?' That's a profound communication. We're not sure what the answer will be." She took him to the property. They spent the first day just walking the perimeter. They covered maybe 5 miles. They didn't see anything. There were old tracks here and there, worn smooth by weather and time, but nothing fresh. They set up equipment for the night. Thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors. They waited. They set up in the office building. They sat in the dark and listened. Around midnight, they heard the vocalization again. The same low resonant sound that Margaret had described to me. Robert said, "Is that it?" Margaret said, "Yes." Robert was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's not an animal. That's something trying to communicate." Margaret said, "I know," Robert said. "The implications of that are very large. We need to document this properly." He wanted to bring in additional researchers. He wanted to set up a more comprehensive study. He said that what they were dealing with was significant enough to warrant serious scientific attention. Margaret was hesitant. She said the board had made clear that they didn't want this kind of attention. Robert said, "Then we do it privately. We do it carefully. We get evidence that can withstand scrutiny. And then we present it to people who can actually do something about it." Margaret thought about it. She was afraid. She said she was afraid of what would happen if she was successful in documenting something real. She was afraid of what the attention might bring. She was afraid of what the media would do. She was afraid of what would happen to the creature, but she was also tired of carrying this alone. So she agreed. Robert began making plans. He assembled a small team of researchers, people he'd worked with before, people he could trust to maintain confidentiality. They came to the property in stages over the winter of 2018. They set up a more sophisticated monitoring system. They were careful. They used the land trust's existing infrastructure to minimize visible presence. They ran cameras, audio equipment, thermal imaging. They collected data. And they waited. The creature seemed to know they were there. Margaret said it was the first time she'd ever felt like she was being studied. The situation had inverted. Instead of her watching it, it was watching them watching it. She said there was a quality of assessment to its observation, that it was evaluating them, learning from them, understanding their intentions. Margaret said that reading the Enoch passages again after this realization made more sense. The Watchers were called Watchers because they watched. They observed. They learned. They were intelligent. This thing living in her property was watching her the way she was watching it. They were on equal footing. By the time spring came around, Robert's team had accumulated substantial footage. They had thermal images. They had audio recordings. They had motion data. And most importantly, they had multiple instances of the creature apparently responding to the presence of the researchers. One night, After the team had been positioned at a particular location for several hours, the creature approached. It came close enough that the thermal camera captured detail. It was 7.5 feet tall. Its body was more muscular than any known ape. The head was wrong for a gorilla or a chimpanzee. The proportions were more canine. The ears stood upright and were positioned higher on the skull than a human's ears. But the overall posture, the way it stood, the way it moved, was not animal. It was bipedal, and it was aware. On the audio recording from the night, you can hear one of the researchers whisper, "Oh God, oh God." The vocalization the creature made after that was different from what Margaret had heard before. It was higher pitched. It lasted longer, almost like a response, and then the creature walked backward, maintaining visual contact with the camera, until it faded into the dark. Robert told Margaret that what they had documented was significant. He said that with careful analysis, with peer review from trusted colleagues, they might be able to present this to the scientific community. They might be able to initiate a formal study. They might be able to change the way we understood animal intelligence and cryptid biology. Margaret wanted to believe him, but she was also afraid. She was afraid of what would happen when the Land Trust Board found out. She was afraid of what would happen when media attention descended on the property. She was afraid of what would happen to the creature if this went public. And she was right to be afraid, because someone on Robert's team talked. Someone sent a summary of the findings to a news outlet in Arkansas. She woke up to it on the news. She had turned on the television for weather and instead found her land, her property, her forest, spread across national media outlets. She sat on her couch in the cottage and watched as reporters stood in front of the office building, the same building where she had sat countless nights watching monitors, the same building where Robert had first heard the vocalization. Now it was surrounded by news vans, helicopters, people. Margaret said she felt sick immediately, not from being exposed, but from understanding what would happen next. The forest would be trampled, the creature would retreat deeper, the study would be compromised, everything would be lost. She tried calling Robert. He didn't answer. She tried reaching the other researchers. Nobody picked up. They were probably dealing with media requests themselves, fielding calls from journalists wanting exclusive interviews, everyone wanting to know what they'd found, everyone wanting to be the first to break the story. No one caring about the actual science anymore. It had become a spectacle, a sensation, a viral moment. She drove to the property. There were already people at the gates, people with cameras, people with thermal imaging equipment of their own, people who had heard the story and driven out immediately to try to catch footage of something, anything. Margaret parked her truck a half-mile away and walked in through the back road. She went to the office building and found it empty. The equipment was gone. The monitors that had captured 4 months of footage were gone. The recordings, all of it. Someone had cleaned it out. She stood in the empty building and thought about everything they had collected. All of it was gone. Everything they'd documented, the clear footage, the audio recordings, the motion data, all of it had been taken. She called Robert from the office phone. He finally answered. He said, "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She said, "Where's the equipment?" He said, "I had to move it. I had to get it out before the property got overrun. People were arriving. People would have stolen it or broken it. I took everything I could gather and put it in storage. For safety." She said, "For safety from what?" He said, "For safety from everything. For safety from the people out there now. For safety from your board. They're already calling me, already threatening me, already telling me that any research conducted on that property was unauthorized, that any results are suspect, that I need to give them everything, or face legal action." Margaret said, "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm going to disappear for a while. I can't be the public face of this anymore. It's too hot. The media attention has made it impossible. Any credibility we had is gone. Any chance of publishing this responsibly is gone. I'm sorry. I have to step back." And that was the moment Margaret knew it was over. Not the media attention itself, but Robert's retreat. He was the only other person who believed, the only other person who had access to the documentation, the only other person who could have helped her fight back against the board's denial, and now he was running. The story broke in April of 2019, Ouachita Land Trust property. Hosts unknown animal, local scientists document impossible creature. The story went viral. It was everywhere. News crews showed up. Cryptid enthusiasts descended on the area. People hiked illegally on the land trust property trying to catch footage of their own. They cut through fences. They left trash. They made noise. The creature disappeared. Margaret said that after the media attention began, she didn't see it on camera anymore. It was as if it understood the threat and had moved deeper into the wilderness, into places where humans couldn't easily go. Robert was devastated. He said the documentation they had was good, but it wasn't enough to make a definitive case without additional evidence. The opportunity was lost. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. They were furious. Margaret was blamed for the leak, even though it wasn't her. Someone told me later that Brennan was convinced she'd done it deliberately, that she'd wanted publicity, that she'd wanted to force the board's hand. They said she'd allowed an unauthorized research project to operate on land trust property. They said she'd violated her agreement with them. They said she'd put the organization at risk. They said donors were threatening to withdraw funding. Thomas Brennan, the lawyer, said that the land trust had a fiduciary responsibility to its donors. Donors expected the land to be managed for conservation purposes, not for some kind of fringe cryptid study. He said the board needed to make a decision. Margaret stepped down or she was fired. Margaret said she tried to explain. She tried to tell them that what they had documented was real, that it was important, that it deserved further study, but they didn't want to hear it. The board had decided that the best course of action was to deny everything. They issued a statement saying that the alleged research project had been conducted without authorization. They said the land trust had taken no part in any cryptid studies. They said any claims of unknown animals on their property were baseless. They said Margaret Thorne had been relieved of her duties effective immediately. The severance package was generous, far more generous than Margaret would have expected for a forced resignation. It was substantial enough that she could afford to take time off work, substantial enough that she didn't immediately need to find employment. This was clearly calculated. The board wasn't just firing her. They were purchasing her silence. They were making it clear that if she spoke publicly about what she had found, they would have grounds to claim she had been financially motivated, that she had fabricated the story for attention, that her testimony was compromised. The non-disclosure agreement made this explicit. It wasn't just telling her not to speak. It was creating a framework where any speech she attempted would be legally vulnerable. The document ran to 17 pages and covered every conceivable way she might attempt to discuss what she had found. She couldn't talk to journalists. She couldn't publish research. She couldn't even acknowledge to friends that she had documented anything unusual on the property. The agreement included a definition of what constituted a violation so broad that almost any public discussion of her experience could be construed as breach. Damages for violation could reach into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were also provisions about criminal referrals, language suggesting that if she violated the agreement, the land trust would pursue charges, though it was unclear what charges would actually be supportable. The message was clear. Silence was the path of least resistance. Speaking was expensive, legally and financially. The land trust was betting that Margaret would choose the comfortable path of quiet acceptance. They were betting that after months of stress and conflict, after being blamed and pushed out and made to feel like she was the problem, she would just accept the narrative they had constructed, accept that her experience was anomalous, accept that she had been mistaken, accept that there was nothing unusual on that property. She signed anyway. She signed because she was exhausted. She signed because she needed the money. She signed because she was tired of fighting people who had institutional power on their side. And she spent the next 3 years living with the consequences of that signature. The severance package was generous, more generous than it needed to be. Margaret understood why. They were paying her to disappear. They were paying her to go quietly and never speak about what happened. The non-disclosure agreement was extensive, 17 pages, detailed, specific about what she couldn't say. She couldn't discuss the research. She couldn't discuss the creature. She couldn't discuss the documentation. She couldn't even acknowledge that there had been any unauthorized research on the property. The document made clear that violation would result in legal action, financial penalties, potentially criminal charges if she was found to have leaked information to the media. They were scared. The board was genuinely scared of what she might say. And they were right to be scared, because she wanted to say everything. She wanted to stand on the steps of the land trust office and tell everyone what they had documented, what they'd found, what she'd seen with her own eyes and recorded on multiple camera systems. But she couldn't. The agreement prevented it. The threat of legal action prevented it. The exhaustion of it all prevented it. After the forced resignation meeting, after signing the severance papers and the non-disclosure agreement, Margaret drove home to her cottage for the last time. She packed a single box of personal items. Everything else she left: books, furniture, clothes. She didn't care about any of it. She drove away from the property and she didn't look back. She told herself she was done with the Ouachita Mountains, done with the land trust, done with the creature, done with all of it. She rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet building on a residential street. The apartment was deliberately unremarkable. Beige walls, carpet that had been there since the 90s, a kitchen barely big enough for one person. She wanted anonymity. She wanted to be invisible. The apartment offered both. When she signed the lease, she paid cash for the first 3 months. The landlord didn't ask questions. In Hot Springs, she was just another person trying to build a life quietly. Nobody knew her. Nobody asked about her past. Nobody cared that she had just walked away from a career and a dream because an institution had decided that her truth was worth less than their reputation. She would sit in that small apartment at night, in the dark, and think about the forest. She would think about the creature. She would think about what it had tried to communicate and whether it had moved on when the media attention came, or whether it was still there, still watching, still waiting for someone who believed. She found an apartment in Hot Springs. She found work consulting on environmental projects. Nothing too demanding, nothing that required her to care too deeply. She moved through her days. She made an effort to live a normal life. But at night, alone in her apartment, she would think about the forest. She would think about the creature. She would think about what it had been trying to communicate. And she would think about the fact that she had left it there, in that forest, watched by the people now supposedly protecting it, with no one left to advocate for it. No one left to believe in it, no one left to care about what it was or where it had come from. She had abandoned it. That was what kept her awake at night. Not the lost job, not the non-disclosure agreement, but the fact that she had walked away from something she believed in because she didn't have the courage to fight for it anymore. There were other signs that Margaret had noticed before the gates started being destroyed. Small things. A deer carcass found too far from any predator territory. The remains weren't consumed, just left. As if something had killed it and discarded it without eating. Wolves or bears or coyotes would have fed. Margaret found 3 of these carcasses over the course of 2 months, unmarked except for the massive trauma. Something with great strength had crushed them, broken their spines, shattered their ribs, then left them. It was a message, a display, a warning perhaps, or an assertion of power. Margaret photographed each one, measured them, tried to understand what she was looking at, but there was no context for it, no frame of reference, no documented predator in North America that behaved this way. She kept the photographs in her log. She showed them to Tom when he visited the property. He looked at them and didn't say much, just shook his head. He said, "This is pattern predation. This is calculated. This isn't random killing. This is intentional display of power." Margaret asked what he thought it meant. Tom said, "I think it means something is telling you that this is its territory, that it controls what happens here, that you need to be aware of that. It's a warning," Margaret said. "A warning to do what?" Tom said, "A warning to leave, a warning to respect the boundary, a warning that you're in someone else's domain now." Living in Hot Springs, Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. She couldn't talk about what happened. The non-disclosure agreement was clear. She couldn't even hint at the truth. When people asked her why she'd left the land trust, she gave vague answers. Personal reasons. Time for a change. She needed a break from the intensity of management work. Everyone accepted these answers. No one pushed harder. No one wanted to know the real story, because the real story would have required them to confront possibilities they weren't prepared to confront. Easier to accept the official narrative. Easier to believe that Margaret had just burned out, that she'd gotten in over her head, that she'd made some kind of mistake that cost her the position. The media coverage had mostly faded. There was a brief spike when the story went viral. News outlets ran pieces about cryptids in Arkansas, about the land trust, about the apparent research. But the land trust's statement denying everything had effectively killed the story. Once an official entity denied it, once they claimed no research had occurred, the narrative changed. It became a hoax story, a case study in misinformation, a cautionary tale about the perils of anecdotal evidence and wishful thinking. The scientists who'd been part of the research quietly disappeared. Some of them denied their involvement. Some refused to comment. Robert vanished completely. Margaret found his organization had effectively ceased operations. The website disappeared. His phone number was disconnected. It was as if he had never existed. She tried tracking him down, called mutual connections. Nobody knew where he'd gone. It was like he'd made a deliberate choice to become invisible, and she understood why. The attention had been too dangerous, the risks too high. Better to walk away. Better to forget it ever happened. But Margaret couldn't forget. She could pretend to forget. She could go through the motions of a normal life. But the knowledge stayed with her. The truth stayed with her. The creature stayed with her. Every night when she closed her eyes, she could see it. Standing in front of the thermal camera, looking back at her. That moment of recognition. That moment of mutual acknowledgement between two intelligent beings. One human. One something else. Both real. Both present. Both aware. Margaret spent a lot of time thinking about what the creature actually was, not what it looked like. She had plenty of footage for that. But what it fundamentally was, the question was harder than it seemed. Was it an undocumented animal? A remnant species that had survived in hidden pockets of wilderness? Evolution taking a path that official biology said was impossible. But the Book of Enoch passages suggested something else. The descriptions of the Watchers weren't about animals. They were about beings with agency, intelligence, intention, the ability to make choices and live with consequences, the ability to create culture and pass knowledge between generations, the ability to observe and to assess and to communicate across species boundaries. If that was what was living in the Ouachita Mountains, then it was something far more than an undocumented species. It was an intelligent being, a person of some kind, trapped in a world that had decided it couldn't exist, hunted implicitly by human encroachment, forced to hide, forced to live on the margins, forced to watch from the shadows as human civilization expanded into its territory. And despite all of that, it had chosen to communicate. It had chosen to let itself be documented. It had chosen to appear in front of cameras as if to say, I am here, I exist, I am aware, I am intelligent, witness me. Margaret believed that it was trying to tell her something, trying to pass along a message that only she might understand, that someone needed to know the truth, that someone needed to bear witness, that someone needed to remember. And she had been chosen for that role. Whether by accident or design, she had been the one to look closely enough, to listen carefully enough, to believe strongly enough, to understand what she was seeing instead of rationalizing it away. That knowledge was both a gift and a burden. It was a gift because it meant seeing the world more clearly, understanding that reality was far stranger than official narratives suggested, knowing that intelligence and agency existed in places conventional thinking didn't look. But it was a burden because once you knew something, you couldn't unknown it. Once you understood the truth, you couldn't pretend the lie anymore. And living with that knowledge, keeping that knowledge, carrying that knowledge forward was something that required constant effort, constant vigilance, constant resistance to the pressure to accept the official story, to accept the denial, to accept the comfortable lie. The reason Margaret agreed to talk to me was that she'd realized something important. The non-disclosure agreement had an expiration date, 20 years from the date she signed it, which meant that in another 15 years, roughly, she would be free to speak. But 15 years was a long time. She wasn't willing to wait. She was willing to talk now, even though technically the agreement was still in force, because she'd concluded that the truth was more important than the threat. If the land trust wanted to sue her, they could. If they wanted to pursue legal action, they would. But at least the story would be out. At least someone would know. At least the creature would be acknowledged, even if it was only in a podcast, even if it reached only a few thousand people, even if it was dismissed as another cryptid story by people who heard it. At least the testimony would exist. At least it wouldn't be completely erased. She said that was what finally broke her silence. Not anger at the land trust, not bitterness about losing her career, but the simple understanding that silence served only the people who benefited from denial. And Margaret Thorne had never been good at being silenced, even when she'd tried, even when she'd signed documents telling her not to speak, even when she'd moved to another city and tried to pretend it never happened. Some part of her had always been waiting for the moment when she could speak again, and that moment had finally come. Even if it was still technically forbidden, even if it still carried risks, the truth was worth it. The creature was worth it. The witness was worth it. There's something else Margaret told me that I need to include here, something that happened during the final months before the media attention. She had become increasingly convinced that the creature wanted her to understand something, that it was trying to communicate not just through vocalizations or through appearing in cameras, but through the patterns of its behavior, the tracks that led to specific locations, the gate destructions that happened on regular intervals, the appearance of carcasses, all of it forming a message if you learned how to read it. She spent weeks mapping every interaction, every location where tracks had been found, every place where the creature had appeared on camera. She overlaid these maps with the geography of the property, and she began to notice something. The creature seemed to be establishing a boundary, a clear perimeter, a marked territory. But unlike normal animals that might mark territory through scent or sound, this creature was marking it through direct action, destruction, display. The gates were being destroyed in a specific sequence, always the same gate first, always leading back eventually to the office building, as if the creature was saying, "This is where the humans are. This is where you live. This boundary around you. Don't go past it." She mentioned this theory to Robert when he arrived. She showed him her maps, the colored overlays, the pattern analysis. Robert studied it for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "If you're right about this, if this pattern is intentional, then we're looking at something far more sophisticated than anyone has considered. This isn't just an unknown animal defending territory. This is a being with the capacity to engineer social boundaries, to communicate through action, to establish rules and expect compliance. That's not animal behavior. That's what humans do. That's how we order our world. We establish boundaries, we mark them, we enforce them, and we expect other humans to respect them. If this creature is doing that, then it's operating at a cognitive level that challenges everything we think we know." Margaret said Robert seemed frightened after that realization, not afraid of the creature, but afraid of the implications, afraid of what it meant if something that intelligent was living in the American wilderness, afraid of what questions that raised, afraid of what answers might come if someone actually pursued this seriously, because pursuing it seriously meant accepting that conventional biology was wrong, that official science had missed something fundamental, that there were intelligent beings living in the margins of human civilization. And acknowledgement of that truth would require restructuring huge portions of what we thought we knew about the world. It would require rewriting textbooks, reopening closed cases, reconsidering missing persons, looking at history differently, rethinking the encounters described in indigenous traditions as actual documented interactions rather than mythology. The weight of that was enormous, and Robert felt it. Margaret said she could see it in his face. The moment he understood that if they succeeded, if they proved this, the world would have to change. And institutions don't like change. Governments don't like change. Science as an established system doesn't like change. There's too much invested in the current framework. Too many careers built on the assumption that there are no intelligent unknown beings in the wilderness. Too much money at stake. Too much professional reputation dependent on the current framework remaining true. So, Robert's fear was justified. He understood that proving the creature's existence wouldn't lead to protection or study or understanding. It would lead to conflict, to denial, to suppression, to the exact kind of institutional response that they would eventually witness when the story leaked. Better to let it remain unknown. Better to let it continue living in the shadows where it had learned to survive. Better to protect it through silence than to doom it through revelation. That was the tragedy that Margaret carried with her. The knowledge that speaking the truth would harm the creature more than protecting it through silence. That being a good witness meant being a willing prisoner of knowledge, knowing something crucial and being unable to share it, seeing evidence of intelligent life and being forced to stay quiet. It was a kind of torture, a peculiar modern form of isolation, where the evidence of contact existed but could never be publicly acknowledged. I asked Margaret at the end of our interview whether she regretted what had happened, whether she wished she'd handled things differently, whether she would have chosen not to document the creature if she'd known it would cost her everything. She was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the street in Hot Springs, at the normal world going about its normal business, people who had no idea that intelligent unknown beings existed just hours away. She said, "I don't regret documenting it. That was the right thing to do. But I regret not fighting harder to protect it after the media attention. I regret stepping down without exhausting every option. I regret accepting the non-disclosure agreement and the severance without fighting for the right to tell the truth. I let fear win. I let the threats and the institutional pressure and the exhaustion convince me to walk away. And the creature paid the price for that. If there are others of its kind in that forest, if it has family or companions or offspring, they're still there, still hidden, still avoiding human detection, still living in a world that's gotten smaller and more dangerous every year. And no one is advocating for them. No one is protecting them. No one even acknowledges they exist. That's the weight I carry. Not the lost job, not the money given to me for my silence, but the knowledge that I was in a position to make a difference and I didn't. Not fully, not completely, not in the way that the creature deserved. I asked her if she would do anything differently if she could go back. She said, "I would have refused the non-disclosure agreement. I would have fought the board. I would have gone to the media myself instead of letting someone else leak it. I would have published the footage online before anyone could suppress it. I would have made it impossible to deny. I would have chosen the creature's freedom over my own comfort. But that's easy to say now, sitting here, 3 years later, with the battles behind me. It's harder to find that courage in the moment, when everything and everyone is telling you to give up, when the people you trusted are walking away, when the system is arrayed against you. It's harder to choose the difficult path when the easy path is right in front of you, offering severance and promises of future peace. Margaret Thorne found out the hard way that institutions are more powerful than individuals, that systems protect themselves first. That truth is secondary to organizational survival, and that sometimes the most courageous choice is not the one that feels brave in the moment, but the one that feels impossible. The Ouachita Mountains are still there. The creature is still there. Margaret is still living in Hot Springs, still carrying the weight of what she knows. And somewhere in the darkness of that forest, something is still watching, still remembering the woman who came close enough to understand, still waiting, hoping that someday someone will come close enough again, and this time they won't walk away. Before I left her apartment, Margaret gave me something, a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was one of the clearer frames from the thermal camera footage, the creature standing fully upright, looking directly at the lens. She said, "That's what I saw every night when I closed my eyes for 3 years. That's what I still see. That moment of connection. That acknowledgement between two intelligent beings. One human, one something else. Both real, both present, both aware."